About the spread of Protestantism. So we're going to talk about the other three Protestant faiths. Remember, the first one we talked about was obviously Lutheranism, started by Martin Luther. But today we're going to talk about the three others, and those are Calvinism, Anglicanism, and Anabaptism. And then we'll also talk about the Catholic Church's response because they're not just allowing all of this to happen. So let's get started. Okay, so with the Peace of Augsburg, that's where we left off last time, Christian unity was lost. Okay, it was pretty much decided that it's never going to be a single Christian church ever again. So a guy by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, that's that handsome fellow right there, he began a new Christian group in Switzerland. And in this Christian group, it was much more disciplined. And so relics and images were forbidden. New service of scripture, reading, prayer, and sermons were adapted. And like I said, much more discipline, much more harsh in punishments and things like that as well. So Zwingli's going to die in 1531. So John Calvin, okay, that's this guy over here, assumed leadership. And one of the things that really sets Calvinism apart from the others is the idea of predestination. So, predestination is the idea that God's already determined in advance who's going to be saved, who's going to go to heaven. Those are called the elect, and who would be damned or who would go to hell, and that's the reprobate. The John Calvin's also going to create a new church government, and it is going to be what's called a consistory. And a consistory is like a council that enforces the moral discipline. And so the court will oversee any type of moral life. So things like dancing, gambling were now crimes. Okay, even though they're not specifically mentioned as part of the Ten Commandments as sins, but they are now crimes within Calvinism. And then Calvinism is going to spread a lot. And one of the things that's really going to fuel this is they're going to send missionaries. So this starts in Switzerland. They're going to send missionaries all over Europe, especially into Germany or the Holy Roman Empire. And so by the mid 16th century, Calvinism became the most important form of Protestantism, and definitely the largest. Okay, so in England, King Henry VIII wanted a divorce from his wife, who is Catherine of Aragon. So they've been married for about 20 years, and she was getting to an age where she can't have babies anymore. And so he still hadn't had a son. So Catherine of Aragon had given him a child to last past infancy, and that was a daughter. Okay, her name was Mary. And so he decides he needs to secure his legacy, and he needs to secure the throne, and he needs to have a son to do that. So he needs an heir to pass the throne on to. So he goes to the Pope, who is Clement VII, and the Pope is not going to annul the marriage. Okay, basically what's going on there is the Pope was recently appointed to the papacy, and Charles V, who was a Holy Roman Emperor, also the King of Spain, happened to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And so he didn't want his cousin Mary to be considered a bastard. So this is a time when being considered a bastard is a big deal. Like, it gets you out of all kinds of things in life. You know, it takes away a lot of your privileges. So he didn't want that to happen. And so he wouldn't let the Pope allow Henry to get an annulment. So Henry decides he's going to make his own church, and he's going to get the Archbishop of Canterbury to declare it null and void. So he's going to start his own church, and then he's going to marry Anne Boleyn. Okay, so that's this lady right here. That's Anne Boleyn. So she's going to have a daughter named Elizabeth. Okay, Elizabeth will eventually become Elizabeth I, and she will actually really secure the legacy of Henry. So the Act of Supremacy of 1534 declares King Henry the head of the new church. So to this day, the Queen Elizabeth II, she is the head of the Church of England, or also known as the Anglican Church. So with this new role, he's going to control religious doctrines, clerical appointments, and discipline. So he not only politically controls England, now he religiously controls England as well. So, and Catholicism under Henry, or I'm sorry, Anglicanism under Henry is basically Catholicism. He was a devout Catholic. One thing that's interesting about Henry is when Luther created the 95 Thesis and it published and went all over Europe. Um, he wrote a pamphlet. It was called "In Defense of Catholicism" or "In Defense of the Catholic Church," and as a result of that, the Pope Leo X, who was a pope at the time, he declared Henry to be defender of the faith. Okay, so this guy who's defender of the faith no longer is part of the Catholic Church. And this is a title still to this day because of Henry that Elizabeth II, the current Queen of England, has as well. So she's got a lot of titles, and Defender of the Faith is one of them. So, okay. This right here is a short little biography, gets a little more into the life of Henry.
Henry VIII was an enormous egoist who pursued policies that led to an enormous amount of turmoil. But in the end, they would create the circumstances that would allow the emergence of a modern country.
Henry VIII is perhaps England's most famous king because of his many wives. But as the second son of King Henry VII, Henry VIII only became heir when his older brother Arthur died in 1502. Henry married Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, but after 20 years of marriage, the couple only had one daughter. His wife, now 40, was unlikely to bear Henry the son he desired, and Henry had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn.
He called it the king's great matter, and he said, "I'll go to the Pope. It'll be a done deal. Bada bing, she's out, you're in, Anne." It wasn't that simple.
The Pope simply prolonged the proceedings. He dragged them out as long as possible, hoping that in the end, Henry would simply decide to keep his mistress and not worry about actually marrying her.
Henry married Anne Boleyn in 1533, while still officially married to Catherine. A series of acts of parliament granted Henry's divorce and placed Henry as the head of the Church of England, breaking connection to the Catholic Church.
There was actually a rebellion in northern England, which was called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was, in certain respects, a Catholic rebellion against the crown. Henry suppressed this violently.
Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, on September 7, 1533.
"We are young, sons will follow," he famously said, reining in his rage. But he soon became quite devastated as no further sons were produced. Anne had a miscarriage, it was a boy, and I think that's what set him off on the road to crazy town.
11 days after the execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536, Henry married Jane Seymour. The following year, Jane gave birth to a prince. She died 12 days later from complications with delivery.
Henry considered Jane to be his one true wife, in a sense, and when he died, he actually had himself buried next to her, sort of romantically.
Henry would marry 3 more times before his death on January 28, 1557. His religious reformation left England in a state of religious turmoil.
Henry VIII should primarily be remembered as the king who allowed the Reformation to happen in England, and as the king who created a much more structured and centralized form of government in England that would be a tremendous legacy for later generations.
Okay, so as you can see, eventually he is going to get his male heir. So Jane Seymour is going to give him that. But as she dies in childbirth, he's going to be looking for other wives. So he's going to marry 3 more women, and we'll talk about more about that when we get into the next unit. So Henry dissolved the monasteries and sold their land to the wealthy. So what he did is he is going to tear down a whole bunch of churches. He's going to actually tear down a bunch of hospitals too. And he is going to sell off the land to wealthy people and gain a lot of money. Now, some of this does actually go into more public works projects, but other goes to fund wars and fund Henry's lavish lifestyle and things like that. But when he dies, his son, Edward, was 9 years old, and he became king. So Edward VI, that's him right there, was very young and sickly. So one thing about Henry is he had syphilis really bad, and that's something that he passed on to his wives, and something Jane Seymour passed on to Edward. And so as a result of that, he was very sickly for his entire life. Um, and he didn't really control England. He had some ideas, but he was very young. So during his reign, a lot of people kind of took advantage of his youth. And so church officials are going to move the Church of England into a more Protestant direction. So things like clergy were able to marry, they're going to adopt a new service more similar to Lutheranism, and they're going to. Henry did this before, but he translated the Bible into English, things like that. Okay, so all of that is going on while Edward is king, but he's going to die. He's going to die at 13 years old. And then his sister, Mary, so Mary is also known as Bloody Mary. She was a devout Catholic. And she's a devout Catholic for a couple of reasons. One, remember her father was a defender of the faith, but two, her mother was Spanish. And there's an old saying, to be Spanish is to be Catholic. So she wants to turn England back to Catholicism. So, in this pursuit, she burns about 300 Protestants as heretics, and that's what gets her the name Bloody Mary. But she's going to die within a couple years of stomach cancer. And her sister, who's that on the bottom, is going to turn it into a much more Protestant type of religion. Okay, so they're going to become, England's going to basically resent Catholicism as a result of Bloody Mary, and then Elizabeth is going to use that resentment to kind of rally it around her. There's a smiley face there because Elizabeth is like my favorite person to talk about in history. So that's a young Elizabeth there when she was still a princess. Okay. So the Anabaptists and the role of women. So the Anabaptists are a different breed for sure, but they rejected the involvement of state and church affairs. They said that government has no political authority over real Christians. So as a result, they would not take office, they would not bear arms, they didn't want to do anything that involved government at all. Okay. They also believe that any member of the community could be a minister. So basically, if you could read the Bible and you could spread the word, then you could be considered a priest. They also baptize adults, and as a result of that, they they wanted that to be a choice, was baptism, so that's why they baptized adults. And then their ideas were considered dangerous and radical. And I forgot to turn this part to pink, but please highlight this whole line. Okay, so their ideas were dangerous and radical. So as a result of this dangerous radical group, the Protestants and the Catholics are going to come together and actually agree on the need to persecute them and basically wipe them out. And so these dangerous radicals kind of went underground, and many of them actually ended up in the United States eventually. So I'm sure you were wondering who these dangerous radicals are today, and the answer to that is they're the Amish. They're the dangerous radical Amish. Very dangerous, very radical. Well, I just think that's funny that they're the Amish today. So anyway, so Protestants did little to change women's roles. So their role was to bear children, and that was pretty much it. They placed family at the center of human life, and they said there's no special holiness from celibacy. Okay. So what does the Catholic Church do in reaction to this? So they're going to do three things, and you're going to need to know these three things for the test or whatever I end up giving you. Okay, so the first thing they do is the Jesuits. Okay, so that's number one. I didn't put numbers on this one. The Jesuits. So Ignatius of Loyola, this guy right here, he's going to found the Jesuits, or this is also known as the Society of Jesus. And what they're going to do is they're going to build a lot of schools, and they're going to use education as a way to spread their message. So there's actually a lot of Jesuit schools in this area. So, for example, probably the best known would be SLU. Okay, but like De Smet is one. You have like Loyola in Chicago. There's a Loyola in Maryland. Those are all Jesuit schools. Okay, so they're going to use education as a way to spread a new type of Catholicism, a new Reformed Catholicism. And so they're going to actually restore Catholicism to parts of Germany and in Eastern Europe. The second thing they're going to do is reform the papacy. So Pope Paul III is going to be elected pope, and he's going to appoint a reform commission in 1537. And basically, their job was to look at the church, look at all the beliefs, and let's get rid of the corruption. And so they declared that it was corrupt policies of the popes that started it all. And so he's going to reform the job of the pope into a less political, more religious kind of position. Okay? All right. And then the third thing is the Council of Trent. So this is the big one. So the Council of Trent is basically what they ended up doing is they got together a group of cardinals, archbishops, abbots, theologians, and they decided they're going to look at everything and they're going to decide what we can keep and what we can't. Okay, so in the end, they're going to make a new catechism. That's this right here. So a catechism is a basically written down set of beliefs for the Catholic Church. So they said you still need faith and good works for salvation. So where Luther says you need faith alone, Catholics say no, you still need to have good works. They're going to keep the 7 sacraments, and clerical celibacy will be upheld. Okay. They also said purgatory is still they still believe in purgatory, and you can use indulgences, but you can't just buy them anymore. Because remember, this is where this whole thing started, was with the sale of indulgences. And so they said indulgences are still okay. The basic idea is still there. You still have to do a sacrifice. You still have to do the prayers. You can't just buy a piece of paper and just expect your sins to be forgiven. And so after these reforms, Catholicism had a renewed spirit of confidence and became unified under the Pope. So it became much, much, much less corrupt and much kind of nicer new Catholicism. Okay? All right. Now, this last thing here, this right here is kind of showing you a map of what Europe looked like religiously. So most of it's still pretty Catholic. So this is around 1600, I believe. 1560 is what it says. So you can see most of it is still orange. Okay, most of it is still Catholic. But there are bits. You see Calvinism here is spread very well in Eastern Europe and in the Nordic countries. Anglicanism has been adopted by England and this little section here. So there's going to be a bunch of wars in Ireland over this, okay? And then you can see these little bits there. Those are all Anabaptist, okay? There's not a lot of Anabaptists because they were very early persecuted. So this is the religious map. Now, these guys are not all going to get along, okay? And there's going to be a lot of fighting. We're going to talk about a big war in the next unit that's going to happen because of this. All right, so that's all I got for you today. I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day, and stay safe out there.